Now let me talk about the resistance that we've experienced in the Commonwealth nations. First off, we must accept that the United Nations, when it was established after World War II, was deliberately intended to be an institution of the peoples of the world. That is, the Charter of the United Nations begins with "We the peoples of the world." And when governments appear and preside in United Nations meetings, they are there as the institutions of the people. It is the peoples that are being represented through the United Nations system, and as the voice of the peoples at the international level, which is the voice of the United Nations. This is not the same for the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, when it was established, was not intended to be a meeting of peoples of the Commonwealth. It was intended to be a meeting of states, of heads of government. And so it is something of, I call it a club of governments, to talk about issues. They're important issues, there's no doubt about it. However, the Commonwealth heads of government meetings, make no mistake about it, is not an opportunity for the meeting of peoples of the world, of 54 countries. And this is part of the struggle that we've been fighting as human rights activists for a long time now. And fortunately, it seems as though some progress is being made. Hopefully, there will be more. I can tell you that when we began as the Commonwealth Association of Indigenous Peoples in 2000, we were finding it very hard to participate in the work of the Commonwealth, and particularly at Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings. I'm pleased to say that this has changed, slowly and only slightly, but it has changed. For example, when I began this work, human rights was not a section in the Secretariat of the Commonwealth. Human rights was covered by the Legal and Constitutional Division. Now at least we have acknowledgement in the structure that human rights requires its own attention. Also, Indigenous peoples have not been mentioned in the Commonwealth for nearly 40 years. If I'm correct, the last reference until recently was made in 1972 in the Singapore Declaration, where it talked about Indigenous populations needing certain recognition. And this is very disappointing because the early days of the Commonwealth, much attention was given to the problems of racism in the Commonwealth. As former empire countries, there was a lot of concern that racism had to be abolished. Racism was called in the communiques an evil to be abolished. And of course we know that the Commonwealth is very active in ultimately dealing with the regime of apartheid in South Africa. So the Commonwealth does have a history and a background of fighting racism, but very conveniently in the 1970s forgot entirely Indigenous populations and made no reference at all to these populations. I mentioned to you that in the adoption of the Declaration, 3 countries, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, voted against the Declaration. If the United Kingdom could have expressed an individual vote, and it was really bound by the unity of the European Union at that time, I would not have been surprised if it had voted against the Declaration also. And I have to say that even though countries now have removed their opposition to the Declaration, there is still clearly concerns that are operating in Australia, in Canada and New Zealand, and in the United Kingdom. I'm finding in the work that I've been doing at the United Nations over the last couple of years that the European Union has found it very hard to express support for the Indigenous peoples. And one of the reasons has been, behind the scenes, the United Kingdom has been resisting absolutely recognition of the Declaration, recognition of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples and so on. So clearly we have a distinct problem in the Commonwealth. I don't have full evidence, but when I was in New York in 2006 and 2007, lobbying with governments to get their support for the Declaration, it was very common for me to come across Commonwealth countries who were concerned about legal interpretations. Their legal interpretations were that the right of self-determination is a right of succession. This, of course, is legal nonsense, and any qualified international lawyer knows it's legal nonsense. for a couple of reasons. There is no such thing as an international right to succession. Succession is a political action. It's not a human right. But more importantly, self-determination is about people making decisions, and it is about human rights, and it is about dignity and rights. Secondly, we run across the notion that right of free prior informed consent amounted to an Indigenous people's right to veto parliaments, sovereign parliaments. New Zealand and Canada in particular were making an effort at the global level of contacting countries, this is before the vote was taken, to inform them that if they voted for the declaration, they would be weakening or denying the sovereignty of the country. And this was supposed to be legal advice that they were given. I was fortunate I had a talk with an Australian official, a very, very senior Australian official at the United Nations, and I called upon Australia to take a more respectable role, a more honest role, a more truthful role, and I believe they did do that. So while Australia voted against the declaration, it did not actively engage around the world in telling countries, at least to my knowledge, that the declaration will end sovereignty of the state. But it disappointed me when I was talking to smaller countries, some of the small Caribbean countries, to have them repeat the same information. And I said, well, look, we can provide you with good, qualified international lawyers and their legal advice. So if you have any questions about this, can we provide it to you? But it was clear that that legal advice was not coming from within their own state. They were relying on it coming from elsewhere. In my mind, I was asking the question, could it be coming from the Commonwealth Secretariat? Was the Commonwealth Secretariat during 2006 and during 2007 active at the international level amongst Commonwealth states in telling them to vote against the declaration? And I also have to ask the question, is the Commonwealth still engaged in that sort of activity? The Commonwealth has not been clear about this. I could even say the Commonwealth has not been honest. I was surprised. I mentioned that I went to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. It wasn't me, it was another delegate, in 2000 in Durban. But I attended most of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings since year 2000, except for the last two in Malta and in Trinidad and Tobago. We lobbied very heavily for them to include in their communiques a reference to Indigenous peoples. And a reference was important because it meant that the Commonwealth acknowledged that we were peoples. But it never happened. So I was surprised at the last CHOGM meeting when the communique did include a reference to Indigenous peoples. It didn't say much, but it did include a reference. So this looks like a beginning and an opportunity. Hopefully this opportunity continues because we know that the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Kevin Rudd, has called upon Australia to be a global leader in recognising the rights of Indigenous peoples. And hopefully we will see something come out of this Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting which will draw attention to the Declaration and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And, if we can be so lucky, to call upon action by the members of the Commonwealth to ensure that those rights are promoted and are protected. So this is the challenge now for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting for Indigenous peoples at the international level. It is time. It's 4 years since the Declaration was adopted. And it is time that the Commonwealth, as an intergovernmental body, acknowledge that it has a responsibility to promote and protect the Declaration, as it does with all human rights standards of the United Nations. It's time for the Commonwealth to resume that commitment it had to non-racism back in the 60s and the 70s, and the fight that they had. It is time for the Commonwealth countries in Africa and in the small island states to not line up with the old Commonwealth, with the UK, with Canada, with Australia and New Zealand in resisting recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples in the respective countries. So at this forum of civil society, calls should be continued to ensure that the Commonwealth has a strong human rights base, that the Commonwealth is about rights of peoples, not just about a club for state leaders, and particularly, if I dare say it, a boys' club. It's not about royalty and class. It is not about high society. It's not about another tier, another level of the human being. The Commonwealth is about peoples. And the Commonwealth has an obligation, when it meets as an intergovernmental body on a regular basis, to have human rights fairly and squarely on the agenda and to involve civil society in that. Now, the ways in which civil society can be involved, and I have to admit here I haven't been keeping up with the mainstream developments in Commonwealth civil society, but we were calling for an ombudsman to be placed in the Commonwealth, and I don't know that that is there yet. There are other ways in which it can be done. For example, the Commonwealth Secretariat could look to engage an Indigenous peoples unit in the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth could be issuing on a regular basis guidelines on how to meet the rights of Indigenous peoples, on how to review constitutions and laws, for example, on how the systems of government, whether they be Westminster systems or common law systems, can be tweaked to overcome what have been colonial barriers to human rights for all peoples in Commonwealth countries. It's also important as a matter of law that the rights of Indigenous peoples, which are recognised in one Commonwealth country, and I can refer here particularly to the 1992 Mabo decision in Australia, if the common law in Australia recognises the Indigenous peoples title that existed before colonisation continues in common law, why can't that be then the legal precedent for all other common law countries in the Commonwealth? Why do people in those countries, and in many countries they're still struggling just to get to the courts, why do Indigenous peoples in those countries have to look to a 30-year future in order to get into the courts to talk about their land rights existing in common law? This should immediately be established as a legal precedent. So Commonwealth lawyers and judges, could be advancing the common law recognition of Indigenous people's rights. That is just part of the suggestions that can be talked about here. I'm not going to go into much more detail at this stage because I know that Tammy Solonek, who is also a board member of the National Congress, is going to present to you and talk to you more about situations here in Australia. So my message to you mainly is that the Commonwealth Heads of Government itself must show leadership on the rights of Indigenous peoples and must issue a clear communication calling upon the state members of the Commonwealth to meet their obligations and to enter into partnerships with the Indigenous peoples to overcome what have been historical boundaries between peoples in these countries. I'll leave you with that message. I wish you well for this conference and success in influencing the Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings with their communiques. Thank you very much.